If you're like most people, you probably throw scraps like this away when you're sewing. But in this video, I'm going to show you why you want to stop doing that and save your scraps instead. I made this rug entirely out of fabric that most people would throw in the trash. You can use the same concept to make coasters or baskets or anything else that's made in a coil shape. This project is really affordable because the only thing you need is this cotton clothesline rope, which you can get usually for pretty cheap. You can also use piping cord or anything else that's made of a soft cotton and is about a 1/4 inch thick. In this video, I'm going to show you the concept of making these, which is the same for any size that you want to do. I'm going to show you the tricks that I learned that made it so much easier for me to make these and use up all of my scraps instead of throwing them away. So the first tip is that you're going to want to take your clothesline rope and roll it into a ball like this. Usually the rope comes folded and wrapped and it'll kind of flop around as you're trying to sew with it. So I highly recommend wrapping it into a ball instead, because then as you're sewing, it just rolls off like this. I promise it makes it so much easier. I really like to have quilting clips to hold my fabric in place as I'm sewing. And again, that'll make more sense once we start sewing. You can save really any size of fabric to make this, anything from like 3/8 of an inch like this, all the way up to this, which is almost 2 inches wide. This is for me personally too wide, so I would cut this in half and then use those strips. If you have fabric that's all different widths, that's okay too. I usually do use all sorts of random widths when I'm sewing, and once you get to the project, you will see why that doesn't matter. These really short strips like this can be a little bit tedious to work with because you have to stop every few inches and rewrap another piece just because they're so short. So if you have a lot of these, one thing I like to do is actually sew them together before you start. And so here is an example of what that looks like. I just have my fabric sewn right sides together. The seam allowance really doesn't matter, and it's not even like sewn together nicely. It's just enough to kind of hold it in place before you sew through it on the rope. So if you like, that's a good way to save a lot of time because you don't need to stop every few inches and rewrap your rope. To make these, you do need a machine capable of doing a zigzag stitch. For my machine, I sometimes have to try a few different stitch lengths and widths of the zigzag to get it to be right. So you can play with those settings on your machine to find what works for you. So we're going to start by coiling the rope and the fabric together in the middle and using a zigzag stitch to hold them in place. For me, this is the trickiest part, and it does take a little practice to get right, so don't give up if you don't get it right the first time. What you're going to do is take your rope and choose a color of fabric that you want to be in the center. Because the center is so tight, if you have a long piece of fabric, it's going to make quite a large portion of the center. So just keep that in mind when choosing colors. I'm going to use this little scrap here and start wrapping. What you're going to do is lay it at an angle like this across the rope with the end of the fabric sort of extending above the end of the rope. And then you're going to wrap it at an angle so that the fabric lays flat on the rope. While you're doing this, make sure you're pinching the end so that doesn't come undone. I like to wrap down a few inches so that this fabric is out of my way when I'm doing the center coil. I'm just going to pinch this with my fingers for now and use a quilting clip to hold this fabric in place on the rope. Then I'm going to start at this end and begin coiling the rope along itself. I like to go about like this, where there's about 2 coils, and then starting in the center, I'm going to do zigzag stitches on my machine. Before you start sewing, the most important thing that you can do is to make sure that your coil is going clockwise. And that means that it's starting here and going in a circle like that. You don't want it to be counterclockwise like this, where the coil is going this way. Because if you do, your rug is going to get bigger this way, and that's going to fill up this space here on your machine, and you're going to be limited to making it as wide as your machine is. By making it clockwise, your rug is going to build out this way instead, and you're only ever going to have one layer of rope over here when you're stitching, and that way you can make it as big as you want. So I'm going to start in the exact middle here by pushing this under my presser foot. And this rope is a little bit squishy, so when I'm beginning it, I need to push it through my machine because the feed dogs can't pull it on their own. So I'm going to push it under my presser foot like that. Put the presser foot down, and then I'm just going to do a few stitches. With the needle in the fabric, I'm going to lift the presser foot up again and rotate this so that the rope that I'm working with is facing towards me. And then I'm going to put the presser foot down again and do a few more stitches between here. And I'm keeping the center crease here between both sides of the rope centered underneath this middle part of my presser foot, and that way the zigzag is going to be catching both sides. Again, I have my needle in my fabric. I'm going to lift up the presser foot, rotate so that the rope is pointing out towards me, and then put the presser foot down and do a few more stitches. So that is how you start the center coil. And before we go any farther, we do need to add more fabric to this because we're going to run out soon. So adding more fabric is really easy. What I'm going to do is take off this clip that I have holding my fabric in place, and I'm going to continue wrapping this around the rope until I get to the end of this piece of fabric. So now I'm at the end, and I'm just going to take my next piece of fabric and put it underneath this, fold it over the top, and pinch that in place. Then I'm going to use a quilt clip and hold that in place again. And now using the new piece of fabric that I just attached, I'm going to continue wrapping around the rope. This is a narrower piece of fabric, but we're still going to be wrapping it the same way and have the same effect. And because this is so short, I'm not going to get very far. And this is why I recommended sewing the pieces together at the ends before you start wrapping. I'm going to keep wrapping, otherwise we're going to have to stop every few seconds and add more fabric. So again, I'm placing this fabric underneath the end of the other fabric, folding that over top, and I'm going to use a clip to hold it in place. As you can see, this is not very neat and it doesn't look pretty, but the good thing is that it doesn't have to. As long as you're wrapping the fabric in a way that covers the rope, you are all good. So again, it really doesn't matter if you're using different widths of fabric because you're not going to notice on the finished piece. One thing that tends to happen when you're wrapping is sometimes the fabric is not going to lay flat. If you're a perfectionist, you can go back and rewrap it so that it does lay flat. But in your finished piece, it's super unlikely that you're going to actually notice that just because of how the fabric gets stitched together. If it bothers you, you can certainly go back and fix these little areas. But for me, it's actually more fun to just go for it and not worry so much about what it looks like. So this is the rope that I have to work with now. And we won't need to stop every few seconds. So I'm lifting up the presser foot again and just rotating my piece a little bit so that it's pointing in the right direction towards me. So every time I rotate, I have the needle in the fabric. I'm picking up the presser foot and just rotating this so that the rope is pointing towards me again, out this way. When I get to the first clip, I'm just taking it out and I'm going to hold this with my fingers instead. I'm going to hold that fabric in place as I rotate this towards me. At this point, you should be able to see if your zigzags are the right width. Mine are actually not catching this outside rope enough, so I'm going to increase the width of the zigzag. It should be catching on one side here and the other side over here as you go along, and that's what secures these in place. If you notice this happening over a short distance, it's probably not a big deal and the overall piece will hold together just fine. But if you're having this happen around an entire circle of your rug, it is going to make it weaker in that spot and it's going to pop out of place. So you can go back over those areas to secure them in place. So for mine, I'm just going to increase the width of my zigzag and that will help catch both sides like it's supposed to. When you get to these areas where your fabrics are overlapping, you're just going to take your rope and lay it over top of that, and that will have the raw edge tucked inside. Once you start building some width on your piece, you'll have to stop less often and you won't need to lift the presser foot every time that you turn. You can sort of just turn it as you're sewing and get that coil shape going. And so this is the basic concept of making a coaster or a rug. So to make it bigger, you're just going to keep wrapping more fabric around the rope and keep going in circles until you get it to the right size that you want. So I'll put some music on and keep going on this one and you can just follow along with what I'm doing. And at the end, I will have some tips for making a larger piece like a rug because you do need to do a few additional things to make it not get warped. And then I will go over how to finish it in a way that looks nice and neat. So at this point, I'm actually where I want to stop sewing and end my coaster. And the way I'm going to do that is to cut the rope and wrap this little piece of end fabric around the end of it. I need a little bit of extra fabric to hide this tail of rope, so I'm unwrapping it a bit and trimming off the end of the rope. Then I'm going to rewrap this around here so that this kind of comes to a point. And then I'm going to use a clip to hold this together, and then I'll remove that when I get to it. So I'm going to stitch up to this point, and then I'll be tucking this underneath the project. So I have my raw end here, and I'm just holding that underneath to create as smooth a line as possible where this ends. And then instead of just ending right here where the fabric tucks under, I'm actually going to sew another row of zigzagging around the outer edge. And I'm going to sew it as close as possible with the right side of my needle coming to the edge of this. Once you get enough practice, you can actually do this so that the stitching catches on the edge and sort of forms this little secure stitching along the whole outside. I'm not to the point where I can do that all the way around, but it's definitely something to aspire to. Either way, this will keep the outer edge more secure so nothing comes undone. So I have my end here, and I'm just going to sew my final stitch around the outside. And so here's the finished coaster. And the last thing to do is just sort of clean this up by trimming off any of the little threads that are hanging out, and then it's ready to use. So making a rug is the same exact concept as making a coaster, but you just keep going until you get to the size that you want. The only difference about making a rug is that you're going to need to have the project supported over the edge of your machine. Because if this isn't laying completely flat while you sew, it's going to start bending up or down, and then you're just going to have a giant bowl. And that might be what you want, but if you're trying to do a rug, you'll want to keep it flat. The best way to keep it from drooping as you're sewing is to build up this area around your sewing machine with books or something else that's going to be the same level as your machine. Or if you have a sewing table that has an indented area for your machine, you're all good and you don't need to worry about that. So for me, what I do is just use books and build them up so that they're the same level as my machine. And then as your rug gets bigger and bigger, it will be supported on here instead of drooping down. And I like doing this to the left of my machine and also behind it. So just make sure you have enough books or something else to do that with. I hope this video inspired you to save your scraps and make something really cool. If you're looking for more scrap fabric projects, check out my video on crumb quilting, which teaches you how to make a quilt block like this out of little teeny scraps. Thanks for watching and happy sewing!